Hello, my name is Alyssa McHugh, and I am a sophomore in the Psychology program at Oregon Tech. I did my final project for Sociology 225 on how a person's race affects their risk of getting diabetes. I chose this topic because diabetes runs in my family and is a major social issue that this nation is facing right now. But I think that before we can really get into how race affects us, we need some background on the disease itself. The CDC defines diabetes as a disease in which blood glucose or sugar levels are above normal. There are two main types of diabetes: type 1, which is characterized by a lack of insulin production in the body, and type 2, which is when the body is ineffective in its use of the insulin being produced. Type 1 is not preventable, but type 2 is, as it is caused by a lack of exercise and a poor diet. Type 2 is also far more common than type 1. About 90% of cases today are type 2. There is also something called gestational diabetes, which is characterized by blood sugar levels that are higher than normal, but below those used for diagnosing diabetes. As you can tell from the name, this occurs during pregnancy, and those women who experience it are at an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes later in life. Diabetes is an incredibly widespread disease, and the number of people affected by it is growing by the second. Currently, it is estimated that around 347 million people worldwide are diabetic. In 2010, 11.3% of adults in the U.S. who were 20 years of age or older had diabetes. That's 25.6 million people in the U.S. alone. 1.5 million people died as a direct result of diabetes in 2012, and by 2030, it is predicted that diabetes will be the 7th leading cause of death globally. This will constitute a rise in death tolls by more than 50% in the next 10 years. It is also estimated that 80% of these diabetic deaths occur in low to middle income countries and in developing countries. The average age of a diabetic in a non-developed country is somewhere between 35 and 64, while in developed countries, the disease is associated mostly with those who are over the age of 65. Diabetes is a leading cause of blindness, amputation, and kidney failure worldwide. People with diabetes are also at an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, which is responsible for 50 to 80% of deaths in diabetics. Diabetes also causes a degree of nerve damage, or neuropathy, especially in the lower extremities, which leads to numbness of the feet. It can also cause decreased circulation, which means that when you injure your foot, it has a harder time healing. If gone untreated, it can cause the tissue to become infected and die off, which can lead to amputation of toes or even of the whole foot. There are many risk factors for type 2 diabetes, but I think the most important is being overweight. It is pretty clear that here in the United States, we have an obesity epidemic occurring. Kids are eating more and more meals that are unhealthy, and they are spending more time indoors playing video games or staring at their phones. Being overweight puts you at risk because in order to be overweight, you generally have to eat an unhealthy diet. When a non-diabetic person eats a meal, digestion causes the blood sugar levels to spike, and the pancreas secretes insulin to drop the levels back down. But when a person's blood sugar is consistently high, the body becomes resistant to the insulin that is being secreted, causing the blood sugar levels to stay above normal for an extended period of time. Diabetes also has a genetic factor. If someone in your family has diabetes, you are at a higher risk of developing the disease yourself. As we age, our blood sugar levels tend to go up as part of the natural process of getting older, which puts the elderly at an increased risk of diabetes as well. And finally, as we will discuss throughout this presentation, a person's race also plays a role in the risk of getting the disease. But what role does this disease play in society? Well, the total health care costs of a person with diabetes in the USA are typically between twice and 3 times those for people without the condition. It was calculated, for example, that the healthcare cost of treating diabetes in the US in 1997 was $44 billion. But people with uncontrolled diabetes are often unable to work for periods of time. So, in that same year, to cover the costs of production loss caused by diabetics who were unable to work, it cost the U.S. another $54 billion. And keep in mind, these numbers were from 1997. Healthcare costs have gone up tremendously since then. That's a huge hit to our economy, and it is all being paid by the taxpayers. So besides the fact that the people of our nation are unhealthy, it is also costing us all a lot of money. Most of the research I found focused on African Americans with diabetes. African Americans are on average 1.8 times more likely to develop diabetes than Caucasians. It is also estimated that 50% of African American women are obese, where only 30% of Caucasian women are considered obese. One possible reason for this is that when white women were asked about their weight, they say they are fat or overweight, whereas when African American women are asked, they tend to underestimate their body weight and size, thinking that they are smaller than they really are. Due to this, eating disorders and low self-esteem are more prevalent with white women. There is a cultural difference in what size is acceptable from culture to culture. African American males are often more appreciative of what they call thick women and encourage their significant others to avoid losing too much weight. This is important because when we talk about reducing type 2 diabetes through diet and exercise, the best way to convince an African American woman to lose weight is likely through explaining the health concerns that come with having a high BMI, or body mass index. On the other hand, a Caucasian woman is more likely to lose weight because she is uncomfortable with the way that she looks. BMIs are also higher for populations that fall lower on the SES scales, although interestingly enough, African American women who have higher levels of education still tend to have a mean BMI that is higher than their Caucasian counterparts. This suggests that there are other cultural differences that play a role in our weights. For example, traditional African American cooking tends to be high in fat, contain a lot of added salt, and most of it is deep fried. When asked about it, African Americans were exceedingly more likely than Caucasians to say that they did not like the way healthy food tastes, that they were not used to eating it, or that they believed they consumed enough fruits and vegetables in their daily diets already. Some studies suggest that African Americans, Hispanics, and American Indians tend to be at a higher risk of developing diabetes because they inherited a gene which helped their ancestors store energy from food for when they couldn't get enough to eat. However, as most of the country is rarely in a situation where we go long periods of time without food, this gene is likely now doing more harm than good. And over the course of life, everyone has to find some way to cope with stress, but it has been shown that African Americans are more likely to cope with daily stressors by eating comfort foods. There is actually a scientific explanation for why this works. It is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical, or HPA, axis, which is a biological process the body uses to increase energy for immediate use, while also suppressing body systems that are not essential at that time for survival. The process goes like this. First, a corticotrophin-releasing factor, or CRF, is released from the hypothalamus. This stimulates the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as ACTH, which causes the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Finally, the cortisol then acts on the hypothalamus and pituitary glands to shut off the release of CRF and ACTH, while also acting on our metabolism and blood sugar levels to make the fight-or-flight response possible. Consumption of high-fat and high-carbohydrate foods reduce anxiety via this HPA axis, but chronic activation of this process has been linked to type 2 diabetes as it promotes insulin resistance in fat cells in the body. It has also been shown that race is strongly correlated with SES levels. According to our book, 22.5% of African Americans who make $50,000 or more annually are considered obese, but 34% of African Americans making under $10,000 annually are obese. Why is that? Well, higher rates of diabetes can be tied to lack of neighborhood resources that support physical activity and healthy nutrition, as well as poor housing. But if neighborhood is the only factor, then wouldn't poor white neighborhoods have the same levels of the disease? A study was done to understand why this is not the case. It was found that when low-income communities are racially integrated and the races are on equal ground, the disparity between race and diabetes largely disappears, as the prevalence of whites with the disease jumps. This does indeed suggest that place is important in diabetes rates as well as race, and these results stand for several other issues, such as hypertension, obesity, and health service utilization. However, it was also shown that blacks living in black neighborhoods, blacks living in integrated neighborhoods, and blacks living in white neighborhoods all still had a higher prevalence of the disease than whites living in white neighborhoods. A report published in the American Journal of Public Health states that for African Americans in particular, there appears to be a race-poverty-place gradient, with non-poor blacks in non-poor neighborhoods having the lowest rates of diabetes, followed by poor blacks in non-poor neighborhoods, non-poor blacks in poor neighborhoods, and then poor blacks in poor neighborhoods. Results from this study are supported by the results from the Moving to Opportunity project, which showed that making it possible for families to move from high-poverty neighborhoods to lower-poverty neighborhoods improved their general health, mental health, obesity rates, and diabetes rates. The social conflict theory we went over in class could be attributed here. For our current class system to work, we have to have the rich and the poor are under a lot more stress. This leads to health issues across the spectrum. But why does the neighborhood someone lives in matter so much? Poor neighborhoods contribute to the high diabetes rates due to their decreased accessibility of healthy food. They tend to have fewer grocery stores and supermarkets, and more fast food restaurants. And interestingly enough, poor black neighborhoods are, in general, farther from the nearest store than are poor white neighborhoods. If that's not bad enough, chain supermarkets are half as likely to be located in black neighborhoods as in white neighborhoods. Healthy food in low-income areas is less accessible, more expensive, and of lower quality than in other areas. From a functionalist and economic point of view, this makes sense, even though it's not morally right. Lower-income neighborhoods are going to have less money to spend on food, so they are less likely to frequent a grocery store than a cheap and quick fast food restaurant. It doesn't make good business sense to keep a store open that isn't making any money, but bringing in fast food chains that are being eaten at every day by hundreds of people does. Poor neighborhoods also tend to have fewer parks, and people are less likely to walk around in them, possibly due to higher crime rates. There is a quote from a study conducted at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies that states, "Place matters for minority communities, not because they are predominantly black or Latino, but because they are impoverished." Although today 90 to 95% of all diabetics are African Americans, American Indians, and Hispanics and Latinos, it wasn't always that way. In fact, in the 1940s, it was predominantly thought to be a Jewish disease. A doctor from Johns Hopkins was even quoted as saying that diabetes was rare in people of color. Diabetes also used to be considered a disease of the wealthy, not of the poor. This was due largely to the fact that in those days, if you had low income, you didn't have the option of eating off the dollar menu at McDonald's. If you couldn't afford to buy or grow your food, you simply went without. So the poor tended to be skinny, as they ate less, while the wealthy, who had an abundance of food, were more likely to be overweight. Very rarely do we hear diseases being described as a religious disease. So why was it described that way in the past? Well, back then, race was defined as a combination of one's cultural, biological, and linguistic traits that help distinguish between groups of people. Using this definition, Jewish was considered a race, as was Celtic, Saxon, etc. But following World War II and the combination of a lot of these races into what we now consider Caucasian, the reports labeling diabetes as a Jewish disease mostly disappeared. But how does this affect medicine today? It affects medicine because it shows just how dangerous stereotyping in the medical field can be. By stereotyping a disease as belonging to one race or another, it shapes the way that issue is prevented, diagnosed, and treated. For example, if something is considered a Jewish or African American disease, someone who doesn't fall under those categories is less likely to be diagnosed with the disease, even if they actually have it. Because of this, I think we should use a person's family history, cultural norms, lifestyle choices, and where and how they live, rather than a person's race, to help us determine what is going on with someone's health. In a clinical application sense, we need to adjust the way we describe disease, and train our healthcare professionals to be less biased based on someone's race. Being a minority doesn't put you at a higher risk of diabetes, but living in a poor neighborhood and eating poorly with little exercise does. As one article on the issue stated, the question is not whether one's genetic makeup shapes one's disease experience, but whether race provides a meaningful way of explaining the variations in human genotypes that influence the human experience of disease. Thank you for your time, and everybody have a great summer.